if you all recognize this term, ecological scarcity, a couple months ago we shared a class about the political thought of a political theorist by the name of William Offals, who wrote a book back in the 1990s that was called Ecological Politics and the Coming Ecological Scarcity. And I want to kind of touch on that again because I think that a lot of the geopolitical maneuvering that we're seeing today, a lot of kind of the changes in one of the kind of the fundamental arrangements and agreements that have been shaping our world, at least for the past two or three generations, for the past 75 years, since World War II came to an end. There's a lot of political commentary, political theorists who agree that we're moving into a new geopolitical sphere. And I think that, that's important for everyone to understand because politics touches our lives, of course, no matter where we are in the world. But I think it's especially important for people who work in the world of development to understand what is changing in the political sphere of the world and how the the practice of development, right? The work with communities, the idea of addressing very real problems such as poverty, such as inequality. How are we going to continue to work in these arenas and these areas, given the new kind of geopolitical order that is emerging? Um, so as a class outline, I kind of want to start by looking at some of the hidden assumptions of what we're going to call the liberal consensus. Liberal, a lot of times that word kind of gets mixed up when we talk about right-left politics, right? If we're talking about socialism versus capitalism. But liberal consensus is the term that I'm going to use to try and kind of outline the general consensus about how the world was going to work for the past 75 years. So starting in about 1950, a little bit before that, after the end of World War II, there was a general agreement on all different sides of the political spectrum about how the world was going to function. Even in the hot in the the darkest world era of the Cold War, when there was this dichotomy between kind of communism, socialism, and capitalism, there were still these agreements about how things were going to work. So I want us to understand the framework of the political framework, the political arrangements and agreements that have shaped the political landscape that all of us have been born into and that have grown up with. And then I want to make the argument that that landscape, that those agreements, that this political arrangement is starting to come untethered. It's starting to unravel. And there's lots of kind of current events that are going on that are showing that the Bretton Woods institutions, right, which was kind of the institutional framework for this new world order, are coming apart, right? And as that comes apart, we're going to take a look at what does the reordering of this geopolitical landscape look like? Obviously, it's still in the works. We're still kind of seeing how different sides, how different nations, how different blocks of nations are moving the chess pieces, right? But I think we're starting to see a move into a multipolar world where the liberal consensus that grew out of the post-World War II era is starting to die, to unravel. And then for the last kind of second part of the class, I want to turn our attention again to how development organizations, how small-scale grassroots communities who still want to work for the improvement, for the betterment, not necessarily the progress. I think we've talked about in other classes about differentiating the idea of betterment versus the idea of progress, right? But for those of us who really believe in helping communities to achieve an autonomous vision of the good life, of betterment, of responding to needs, to creating a good life given the conditions and where we live. What are the choices before us, right? And how can we respond to this emerging geopolitical reality? So that's kind of the idea. At the end of this class, I do want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions and experiences because I kind of want to end with a few kind of imaginary or made up kind of cases so that we can kind of start to reflect on how development organizations could respond both positively and negatively. So I want to end with a few kind of made up case studies and then hopefully hear from you all some ideas that you might have because I'm still trying to figure out myself how we might move into this new geopolitical reality within the framework of the development industry. Okay, so let's start. The hidden assumptions of the liberal consensus, right? So, if you'll remember, about a couple months ago, we were talking about this man, Patrick Offals, is a wonderful political theorist. He's written lots of books, lots of short pamphlets, and treatises on politics. And one of the central tenets of his thought is essentially that politics, as we understand it for the past 75 years, politics in the sense of the Western world, has only existed in this temporary explosion of access to resources, to energy, where the ideals of consumption and economic growth were kind of the prime drivers of all of our political movement, of all of our economic arrangement, right? And he says that this is something that separates our era, right, from the rest of humanity. For the 10,000 years of civilization, human beings have always ordered themselves politically within a framework of scarcity, right? This idea that there are real limitations and restraints to what we can have, right? To what we can use in order to suffice our needs, right? In order to provide a good life for the vast majority of citizens, of people who share a reality, who share a geographical territory. And only in the last 200 years, give or take, have we kind of transcended this idea of ecological scarcity, transcended this idea that there are limitations, right? And Awful says that that has happened through a combination of different factors. One of the main factors is that we found a magical source of energy, right, in fossil fuels. So coal, natural gas, petroleum gave us a concentrated source of energy that we had never had before. People had always used energy, whether it be solar energy in the form of agriculture, using animals as draft animals for agriculture, using the power of rivers, right, for milling, and then also using the power of slaves. One of the biggest ways that civilizations or empires in the past grew was through conquest and through slave labor, right? But all of those, whether it be solar energy, using harnessing the power of animals, harvesting the power of wind and rivers and water, or the more violent sources of using human energy through slavery, through colonial exploit, all of those had very real limitations, right? The Roman Empire could only expand so far before it collapsed in on itself. Slaves could only be mistreated so far before there was revolts and rebellions. Rivers only provided so much energy. And it was only in this last 200 years where all of these kind of limited sources of energy were drastically replaced by something that allowed us to feel as if we were gods. And one of the images that Offals uses in many of his books is that all of a sudden, all of us were pharaohs. All of us had this enormous amount of power and energy, and that opened up the world. It allowed us to mine more things, to have more things, to travel farther, to go faster. It changed the scale, the pace, and the patterns of traditional habitation of place, right? And what Offals argues is that we are returning to a moment of ecological scarcity, this temporary boom in energy and resources that allowed us to change things is coming to an end. So scarcity in general, according to Offals, erodes the material basis for the relatively benign, individualistic, and democratic politics characteristic of the modern industrial era. Ecological scarcity, in particular, seems to engender overwhelming pressures towards political systems that are frankly authoritarian by current standards, for there seems to be no other way to check competitive overexploitation of resources and to ensure competent direction of a complex society's affairs. What Offals is saying here is that as we begin to butt up, right, to hit the very real limitations that come with living within the restraints of a biophysical system, of a territory, of an ecosystem. What we're going to see is that all of the political institutions that defined modernity are no longer going to be up to the task, right? Another thing that he says is that the Western political paradigm, what we're saying is the liberal consensus, all of this idea of individualism, of representative democracy on a nation state scale, even the idea of human rights, all of this is enframed within an idea of abundance, right? That the political sphere exists to bring ever more people into this pathway of consumption, into this pathway of more energy use, into this pathway of exploitation of the natural world so that we can have more, consume more, use more, right? And so he says that the Western political paradigm, especially in the developed world, exists only to provide people with pathways to consumer abundance and to develop technologies that allow us to acquire ever more riches, ever more wealth, ever more comforts, etc., right? The most successful political platforms, political parties, political persons, right, are those who have been able to say, this is what we want to give you, right? This is what politics is about opening up the wonders of the world, making more and more consumption available to more and more people, right? And what Offals is saying is that that has worked fairly well. The idea of human rights is encoded in this idea that more people can consume more things, right? It's kind of a limitation of what maybe human rights is really about, this idea of the fundamental dignity of every human being. And Offals argues that reducing the human being to a human consumer is a limitation on our identity. It's a limitation on who we really are. But the politics of the last 200 years have been oriented towards that. People understand their idea of human rights as the ability to consume, right? The ability to have things, right? We can talk about, the human right to water, right? But what many people, especially in urban areas, understand is that they have a human right to a service, right? That the state must provide the service of water. But what Awful says is that that takes us away from the idea that human right to water is also about protecting where the water comes from, ensuring that the water sources are clean, that they're protected, that the springs continue to flow, that the rivers continue to flow cleanly, that the water cycle is understood and respected. And when we reduce this idea of a human right towards water is simply that we have to have it available, whether it be through a private organization, private corporation, whether it be through a state. But this idea of water as a service, rather than water as something that is a resource that needs to be collectively governed, is a big change, right? And one of the things that he says is that this idea of politics as a pathway to consumption, or this idea of human rights as a right to a service provided by the private sector, the public sector, is only possible in a world of abundance, right? But that the loss of this material abundance is the beginning of the destruction of the Western political paradigm. He says, looking at the capitalist world, the premise of abundance that is necessary to support the famous invisible hand of the market is vanishing, right? We're starting to see that this kind of craziness, this ignorance of modernity, that we're going to have unlimited economic growth, unlimited consumption, unlimited mining, unlimited waste within a planet that has very real biophysical limitations, boundaries, restraint mechanisms built into it. Eventually we are going to hit a wall. And many people say that we're starting to see that, right? So now that the liberal consensus is starting to unravel, before we can understand what is replaced, it's important to understand really what were the institutional arrangements, right? Especially in the last 75 years or so, that have given birth to this globalized, growth-oriented, political economic model that we understand. My life was born into this model. It's what I kind of understand. It's what all of us see when we think about politics. And one of the best ways in terms of like the institutional arrangement of the liberal consensus, the institutional arrangement of the modern political society is what was created in the aftermath of World War II, right? World War II kind of brought to the end this uh, tumultuous and turbulent 30 or two world wars where Europe and North America and parts of Asia, underwent this enormous violent period, and that all of the colonial areas throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout Latin America, kind of felt yeah, all of the rumblings of these decades of disastrous war. And after in the ending years of World War II in 1944, right before World War II ended. There was a series of conferences in Bretton Woods, which is a small town in New Hampshire in the United States, and the USSR and the United Kingdom and the United States and many different countries in Europe and throughout the world came here and they sat down. They said, we cannot continue this pathway of just continuous warfare amongst the world's powers. If we continue this, we're going to end civilization. We're going to and especially now that nuclear weapons had been invented and we had seen how strong and powerful they were. There was this kind of this agreement that we have to do something. We have to come together and learn to work together, right? And so what emerged from these series of conferences, what's known as the Bretton Woods model of development, which was and still is in certain ways the institutional arrangement of modernity. So the Bretton Woods model of development, quickly, is a series of agreements that described and outlined how the nations, especially the powerful nations around the world, would be able to engage with each other in a solution other than war, right? They understood, look, we've been fighting amongst ourselves for the past 30 or 40 years. We're creating a disaster. How can we change this? And what they did is they said, instead of fighting for each other, we're going to work together to exploit the world, to try and create this model for economic development, economic growth. And they created several intergovernmental organizations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, all of these huge intergovernmental organizations that were kind of under the auspices of the United Nations. Were created to think about things globally, right? For the first time, we were starting to understand ourselves as a global population that could work together to exploit the earth, to really open up pathways of development and riches and wealth for the vast majority of people, to facilitate global trade, to make it so that it would be more profitable for nations to trade with each other in our own self-interest rather than fight each other in war. This type of solution could not have happened that much earlier in time, either because industrialization hadn't gotten far enough to be able to do massive global industrial supply chains to ship stuff around the world, right? So these kind of agreements started in this moment of technological innovation, where the first time, we really could open up the world to global trade, where we really could, the beginning of kind of modern communication systems was starting to open up as well. And today, if we fast forward 75 years, we live in a framework that's completely kind of defined by these Bretton Woods organizations and institutions. Most of what every day we use in our lives is made on a six-continent supply chain. The computers, the cell phones, the tablets that we're all using right now to be connected, all of the different parts and materials were either mined or manufactured or put together on six different continents, right? We are completely dependent on this interdependent model of globalization, right? The Bretton Woods world order was created on the assumption that unlimited GDP growth it popular to be able to mine the natural resources to push this ever growing and increasing world economy. The hope was that rising waters would raise all ships. The Bretton Woods framework never said that this economic development model was going to be equally distributed, but the idea was that as we continued to grow the economy, everybody would eventually benefit, right? That this model of economic interdependence would also slow or at least try to stop hot wars between the world's superpowers. And since 1945, there hasn't been necessarily a war between, superpowers. There's been lots of proxy wars. There's been lots of smaller scale wars, of course. It hasn't been, a period of peace, but there has not been, a major world war sense. So in that sense, you could say the Bretton Woods model was successful. However, many political commentarists, and people who look at the world that we're creating are starting to talk about the breakdown of the Bretton Woods institutions, right? The recent geopolitical events, the tariff wars that are going on right now between the United States and the rest of the world, the wars that you see between Russia and Ukraine, the coming geopolitical tensions between China and the United States, between Russia and Europe. Um, we're starting to see the creation of economic blocks of countries. This idea that we're all going to be an integrated whole in the miracle of globalization, but rather we're starting to see that the world is being divided up into geopolitical strongholds, right? You see the United States starting to say that we're going to return to this ideal or this Monroe Doctrine, where pretty much the entire Western Hemisphere is seen as the backyard of the United States, the space where it is going to control. The fact that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, recently traveled to Greenland uninvited by the country, to essentially say that sooner or later, you are going to be ours. You are within our sphere of influence, and this is going to be kind of our colonial space, right? It's kind of this neo-colonial carving up of the world into different blocks. Russia is seen is in many places saying, Ukraine, or at least parts of Ukraine, are going to be yours. The old USSR, the old Soviet Union, is kind of being given over to the sphere of influence of Russia. I think it's probably not too far away to see that China is going to exert more influence over Taiwan and many other parts of Africa and certain parts of Southeast Asia as well. So despite this rhetoric that we're still growing, that globalization is all fine, that the world order is continuing to go along. I think what we're seeing through this dividing up of the world into these economic blocks is that the world's superpowers are showcasing that there is a realization of this coming ecological scarcity, right? That there is limitations that we are butting up against, right? And I think that in what we talked about in the last class, that the replacement of aid as a moral obligation in lieu of aid as advancing strategic, economic, and geopolitical interests is part of this reality. Countries are saying we no longer have the ability to splurge, half of 1% of their GDP on food aid for countries who are going through famines or through providing medicines for HIV and AIDS around the world. They're simply saying we can't do that anymore without ensuring that part of this aid is an investment that advances our strategic investments. All of this, I think, showcases and is proving that this liberal consensus, the Bretton Woods institutional framework of the world for the past 75 years, is unraveling. Right. Another thing that we see is that one of the fundamental assumptions of this liberal consensus is that there was always going to be more energy. More energy allowed us to open up more of the world's resources, allowed us to push globalization ever farther. In the most powerful, strongest people in the world are starting to say that this isn't the case. Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, which is one of the most powerful and influential companies in the world, the company behind ChatGPT. He recently said in an interview that there is no way to get there, talking about the development of AI and pushing AI into every sector of our economy is not going to be possible without a breakthrough in energy sources. It motivates us to invest more in fusion, this kind of ephemeral ideal that one day we will be able to break or crack nuclear fusion. Elon Musk earlier this year in the Bosch Connected World event. He was invited as a speaker, and he said that it is very possible that by late 2025, late this year, we could face an electrical drought that will turn our lives, our daily lives, upside down. So two of the most powerful, most influential, most wealthy people in the world are starting to see that this idea of continuous energy abundance uh, might not be something that we continue to live on. It might be something that, we might begin to see the idea of scarcity, right? Of electrical scarcity, of energy scarcity. And the less energy we have available to us, the less we're going to be able to extract more and more resources. I want to show this before we get to this one. This here is our two graphs that show EROI is called energy return on energy invested, right? And it shows how much energy you invest in anything, in mining certain materials, energy return on, for example, getting this is for the U.S. oil and gas industry. So in 1920, for every barrel of oil that we invested in searching for oil and extracting it, we received about over 1,200 barrels of oil in return. It's a 1 to 1 to 1,200 ratio. Pretty good, right? You invest 1 barrel of oil in digging a hole and pumping the oil out of the ground and refining it, and you get 1,200 barrels of usable gasoline or diesel or bunker oil, whatever it might be. In 2020, that's by 2025, I just saw a recent report in terms of oil, that's expected to go down to about 5 barrels to 1. So we went from 1,200 to 1 to 5 to 1, right? And this here show this other graph. Let me move this over here as you can see. This is not only talking about oil and natural gas, but about pretty much every other type of resource, right? As it becomes more expensive to extract oil, fossil fuels, carbon, natural gas, it also becomes more expensive and harder to extract all of the different natural raw materials that we need, right? So we're starting to see that we are butting up against this ideal of abundance, right? And we're beginning to see that this abundance of resources and energy is starting to end. And so this idea of how do we politically respond to ecological scarcity? Well, I think what we see here is that nations, powerful nations like the United States, are saying, well, we need to start to secure the few remaining reserves that we know are available. If Greenland has an enormous amount of energy and resources, well, we're going to kind of return to this colonial form of world domination and say that this is ours, right? If and the United States is not the only one that's doing that. Russia is doing that. China is doing that. All of the world powers are struggling to try to secure for themselves strategic reserves, the remaining strategic reserves, to continue to try and push ahead. Um, but this idea of how do we politically respond to ecological scarcity is this recurring idea, right, throughout the history of politics, throughout the history of civilization. Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote the famous The Prince, which is probably the best work on how we do hard politics. He wrote this, thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. Sorry. He said, the Romans did in these instances what all prudent princes ought to do, who have to regard not only present troubles, but also future ones, for which they must prepare with every energy, because when foreseen, it is easy to remedy them. But if you wait until the crisis approaches, the medicine is no longer in time because the malady has become incurable. For it happens in this, as the physicians say it happens in hectic fever, that in the beginning of the malady, it is easy to cure but difficult to detect. But in the course of time, not having been either detected or treated in the beginning, it becomes easy to detect but difficult to cure. Thus it happens in affairs of state. For when the evils that arise have been foreseen, which it is only given for a wise man to see, they may be quickly redressed. But when, through not having been foreseen, they have been permitted to grow in a way that everyone can see them, then there is no longer a remedy, right? So Machiavelli, hundreds of years ago, was kind of saying that this is the issue of statehood, of statecraft, of politics, right? That as we grow, and as our societies become more and more complex, it's difficult to foresee all of the different crises that we might be creating. And if we don't foresee those crises and if we don't react on towards them, then it's going to be too hard to remedy them. And I would say that, this type of these graphs are showing that, back in the 1970s, 1960s, 1950s, there were a lot of people who are starting to talk about global climate change, about the peak oil or peak resources. But we haven't heeded the call. We've kind of ignored these siren songs. And now, as Machiavelli says, if you ignore this for too long, then it gets too serious and there is no remedy, right? Real quick, before we turn to how the development organizations can respond, we talked earlier about the idea of human rights. And I know that a lot of us who work in the world of development, this idea of promoting and defending and helping people to understand their human rights is kind of a central tenet of the development paradigm. And I think obviously that human rights are extremely important. However, like I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's very essential that we understand how we frame human rights, because human rights mean one thing within one framework of modernity and one framework of how we understand the world, how we frame our politics, and they mean something completely different in a world where ecological limits, where ecological scarcity is a reality, is part of the human predicament, right? So human rights, yes. But to what, right? In what sense? How do we understand this idea of human rights? If we conceive of human rights as an entitlement to unlimited consumption, to economic growth, to unrestrained access to technology, to energy, etc., when we are inevitably going to be butting up against the natural restraints of limitations of the ecosystems in which we live. This world, right, that shows these graphs. If we say that every person in the world has a human right to consume as much energy as a person in the United States, an average person in Europe, or whatever, then our conception of human rights is bound to fail. There's simply not enough. If we say that human rights is the ability to consume, as does this model of the American dream, um, then we're bound to fail, right? So instead of human rights structured within this conceptual framework of a world in constant economic growth, I would say in many, Ivan Illich, one of my favorite writers, was also back in the 1970s very kind of critical of this idea of this leveling of human rights and consumption. And he said that instead of the concept of rights as a framework for achieving societal well-being, he argued that they often lead to dependence and hinder what he considered genuine liberty. So he talked a lot about, instead of this idea of rights, which he associated with the growth paradigm, the industrial economy, he said what we need is the liberty for people to live their vernacular reality, right? What he talked about, conviviality, the state of shared, self-determined, and free creation, where individuals had the capacity to utilize the tools, the resources of their territories, of their places, without being controlled by institutions, professions. He suggests that the pursuit of rights, when it's structured within this framework of the growth paradigm, can actually limit individual freedom and autonomy by creating a system of dependency on external authorities and specialized professions. I would say it also about creating dependency on a model of growth that we simply cannot continue, right? And so how do we who care about human rights understand that human rights might look different, might be structured different within a world of limitations, right? How can we ensure the right to a healthy diet, a right to clean water within a world of diminishing energy per capita usage, diminishing per capita throughput in terms of global economic output? And I think how we understand that is going to understand what type of development we depend on, right? So, given this geopolitical reality, given the restructuring of the world, given the fact that we're butting up against a very real ecological scarcity, what is the response of the developing world that, given the conditions, will never have the chance to achieve the gold standard of development? If we can never hope to all live according to the standards of the American dream, well, then what are we pursuing? What does it mean to work in development if it's not about trying to replicate, these examples, these models, standards of consumption, right? And I would say that today we have two paths, right? First is to submit to the domination of the colonial pull of their geographic space. If For me, I live in Central America. Many development organizations might say, well, the best way that we can continue to receive aid and development funds is to ensure that whatever we're doing is advancing the strategic interests of the United States. Because we live in the Western Hemisphere, and the geopolitical reality that is starting to come about is that we are going to continue to be the backyard, right? The backyard of the United States, and we need to forge development projects that respond to this emerging geopolitical reality. Or I would say that the other response is say we need to question this idea of growth. We need to question this idea of the liberal consensus. We need to question the idea of human rights as ensuring that everybody can insert themselves into the globalized economic order, and think more about bioregional spheres of autonomy and resilience. Several months ago, or maybe about a year ago, we shared a class on bioregionalism, right? Bioregionalism is a philosophy and a social movement that's active in different areas around the world that focuses on local, self-sustaining communities based on natural boundaries called bioregions rather than political borders. It emphasizes the interconnectedness of humans and nature, encouraging a deep sense of place, promoting sustainable practices within a region's unique ecological and cultural context. A couple months ago, my family and we have a 10-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And we took a trip from El Salvador to Nicaragua, and you have to cross two different borders. You go from El Salvador into Honduras, then Honduras into Nicaragua. And my 10-year-old and my 6-year-old, we'd been doing geography classes about Central America. And when we got to the border, the first border between El Salvador and Honduras, and then to the second border between Honduras and Nicaragua, they were all excited that they wanted to see the lines. It's because, as we had been teaching them geography, they wanted to see these lines that they saw on the maps. And we were trying to explain to them, well, actually, those lines don't really exist. There's nothing there that shows you that, right? The political carving up of the world into nation states was not done necessarily, with any idea of interconnectedness of bioregions. In some cases there might be a river dividing a country, but in many times it's just a line that was drawn on the map, right? In this idea of bioregionalism, it essentially says that these imaginary lines of the nation state model need to be transcended in terms of understanding the shared space of where we live, right? And I would say that one of the pathways for development organizations, in the coming years, is to kind of refocus on this bioregional model. In my part of the world, this tiny isthmus between North America and South America, which is known as Central America, we have 6 different countries, right? We have 6 small, very different countries that are not at all interconnected. We have tariffs, we have strict borders, we have customs agents and things like that. That kind of stops this interconnectedness, which would be a natural, I think, kind of reaction to this shared space. And so organizations that operate, development organizations that operate in Central America, instead of understanding, that their role as a development organization is to kind of put themselves in a subservient role to the colonial powers of the United States or Canada or whoever is giving the development money, and understand that we need to create this more bioregional block within Central America where we emphasize taking care of local ecosystems. We emphasize local self-sufficiency, and localism doesn't necessarily mean, just my community, just my household, just my municipality. No, we can talk about localism bioregionalism on a broader scale? How do we create local self-sufficiency within Central America? Talking about my part of the world. I have a friend who is an energy or an expert in electrical systems in how to create electricity systems. And he's working right now on a report. He's working for the Guatemalan government about how all of the different Central American countries, through a true interconnection of their electrical grids, could be 100% sustained by completely renewable resources, so hydroelectric energy, geothermal energy, solar, wind, and other sources, without any sort of dependence on importing fossil fuels. As it stands right now, El Salvador and Guatemala and other countries import between 30 and 40% of our electricity comes from mostly from natural gas that is imported from the United States. But if we were to talk about integrating the electricity sector of this bioregion, right, we would be able to completely sustain a renewable energy system, right? But it's about understanding the idea of ourselves as a block, as a bioregional system instead of this interconnected, globalized world, right? Bioregional development pathways should that focus on reducing dependence towards the states of power, reducing dependence on development dollars is the first thing, right? We need to if we believe in bioregionalism, if we're going to organize our development pathways to really focus on localization, that's going to force us to reduce dependence on global economic commodities, right? We're not going to be able to ship in corn from North America or natural gas from Russia or whatever it might be. It's also going to be reducing dependence on development dollars that seek to force subordination to outside strategic interests. It might mean saying no to that $1 million development project if that development project is forcing a country or a region to open up their boundaries for exploitation, for mining, whatever it might be. And it also is about reducing dependence on a homogenous colonial definition of what real development entails, right? So how should development organizations respond to this reality? One thing is this idea of subsidiarity, right? Which is an idea that the state, whether it be on a national scale, whether it be governance on a more local scale, is an instrument to promote human dignity, to protect human rights as we understand them in a localized kind of self-sufficiency standpoint, and develop the common good. Subsidiarity, however, holds that such functions of government should be performed at the lowest level possible, as long in talking when we mean the lowest level, we're talking about the most local possible, as locally as possible, as long as they cannot be performed adequately. When they cannot, higher levels of the government must intervene. So when we talk about food production, we've talked about this in many different classes, the idea of supporting strong agrarian economies. Almost every area of the world should have the ability to feed themselves on the territory, the ecological resources that they provide through permaculture, through agroecology, through traditional farming, through certain technologies that can help to improve. There is absolutely no reason that we need to have a global kind of trade in the area of agricultural commodities, right? If we can do something locally, we need to do it locally. And it's about using governance, right? Whether it be national governments, local governance, to really try and create and potentiate these abilities, right? However, there are things that will require larger scales of governance. For example, global climate change. Global climate change is caused by things that all of us engage in. But to really respond to this, we do need some sort of global governance structure. But global governance, the need to have some sort of, UN nation, UN model or whatever it might be to respond to global climate change doesn't mean that we need to outsource all our governance to national or international standards, right? To end with, I kind of end with two case studies that hopefully then we can expand on. I would love to hear from you all about how development organizations can respond to this changing geopolitical reality in which we find ourselves. So let's take a case study on food security versus food sovereignty. And I want to try and kind of juxtapose two different countries, right? So let's say country
Tobias
A.
Roberts, remember to,
Yeah.
remember to leave time for questions.
Okay. I will
I have
finish
to
here with
leave.
these.
Dr. Conbuto is going to step in and help you with the questions when they come up.
Okay. Sounds good. I'll be done in 2 minutes here. So yeah, country
Okay.
A. In order to continue receiving grants for food aid, a agricultural development assistance in the line of Bill Gates' GMO push and similar paternalistic agricultural programs, this country's prime minister is forced by a cohort of donor countries to A, sign long-term leases over the country's strategic mining reserves at below market rates. Very similar to what's happening in Ukraine today. B, this country's agricultural minister has to agree to purchase all agricultural inputs from the donor country's corporate monopoly. If you take our development money, you also have to buy things from our agro corporations. And C, the country is also forced to sell large portions of the country's prime farmland to corporations tied to the donor country who are looking to create a strategic land reserve around the world to ensure food security for its own citizens in the coming years of energy scarcity and rising geopolitical tensions. This model of land grabbing, which in Africa, China is very active in building up this huge reserve of land, right, for their own citizens. All of these kind of forceful things, signing leases to open up mining, buying things from the, creating more of an economic demand, and land grabbing are things that are already happening, right? And I would say that development projects, people who want to continue to access aid as it's within this geopolitical framework are more and more going to be required to sign agreements of this model. Country B, on the other side, on the other hand, opts for a more bioregional approach. So after the global freeze on development grants in 2025, this theoretical country overhauled its budget to dedicate 20% of annual expenditure to improving national agricultural production, understanding that providing food for their citizens was going to be one of the most fundamental and important aspects of governance. This country created its own fertilizer plant with over 50% of production being dedicated to organic inputs. Farmers were granted zero interest loans for production during a 5-year transition period. Free trade agreements were signed with 4 neighboring countries to provide for improved access to vital food products and to protect against seasonal fluctuations in temperature, rainfall, etc. After 5 years, the country had reduced food inputs by 90%, and the 4-country region was on path to be completely autonomous in food production within the decade. This last kind of model or case, might seem very idealistic. But I won't talk about this right now so we can leave time, but I would urge everyone to kind of take a look at how the country of Cuba, who of food insecurity, all of this very similar. Suddenly, this country found itself without access to its prime trade partner, without access to an enormous amount of agricultural inputs. And over a 10-year period, Cuba went from a net importer of foodstuffs to producing over 90% of its own food materials. So these types of differentiations about how we